Good morning. I'm Ellen Horstman at First United Methodist Church in Camden, Arkansas. This Sunday I'm returning to the Maxie Dunham book of the 12 Parables of Jesus, and we're going to be looking at the 9th parable in this series, and that is found in Matthew chapter 13, beginning with verse 24. So let me read this parable. It's sometimes called the wheat and the tares. You'll hear it translated in the Common English Bible as weeds, but some translations call these weeds tares, T-A-R-E-S. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like someone who planted good seed in a field. While people were sleeping, an enemy came and planted weeds among the wheat and went away. When the stalks sprouted and bore grain, then the weeds also appeared. The servants of the landowner came and said to him, "Master, didn't you plant good seed in your field? Then how is it that it has weeds in it?" "Well, an enemy has done this," he said. The servant said, "Do you want us to go and gather them?" But the landowner said, "No, because if you gather the weeds, you'll pull up the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow side by side until the harvest. And at harvest time I'll say to the harvesters, first gather the weeds and tie them together in bundles to be burned, but bring the wheat into the barn." So there's our little parable of the wheat and the tares, and what are we to make of it? I think a lot of times what we do is we focus on the end of this, and we see that the weeds are going to be burned, and there's a little part of us that goes, ah ha ha, we know those bad people are going to have their comeuppance one of these days. But I really don't think that's where our focus needs to be. We need to be looking to the wheat and the weeds and trying to figure out how do we live with these things together. One of the things this parable makes perfectly clear is that there is evil in the world. And we know that. There is evil in the world. There is evil around and among us, especially, let me maybe give another word for evil. Let's call it sin. There's sin in this world. There's sin all around us. And friends, we know that there is sin and evil within our own selves. And so there's evil in the world, and we can't get rid of it. We want to, but we can't do it. We go through all kinds of gyrations trying to get rid of evil, and we normally are trying to get rid of it in other people. Take a look at the Pharisees of Jesus' day. Now, they did want to purify evil out of their own hearts, but of course they also wanted to look down on everyone who didn't follow religion in the way that they did. So they came up with these very strict moral codes and tried to walk that straight way and basically have nothing to do with anyone else who wasn't just like they were. We see some of that intolerance in the disciples of Jesus. What? The disciples of Jesus, somewhat intolerant? You see, they were looking for a Messiah who would bring a moral reformation. And so they weren't tolerant of people that didn't fit into their little fellowship. A great example of that is in the Gospel of Luke. Now, at this point in the Gospel of Luke, not only have the disciples already acknowledged that Jesus is the Messiah, but James and Peter and John have gone up on the mountaintop and seen him transfigured, and it is John who will come to Jesus and say, "Well, we saw a man casting out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he wasn't one of us." Do you hear the moralizing going on there? Do you hear the attempt to say somebody else doesn't fit and we've got to get rid of them? We want to get rid of evil, and especially if it's in someone else. But when we are trying to get rid of evil and when we are trying to make everybody else perfect, we are basically tilting at windmills. Yeah, you see I'm going to step back here, make sure you see my little t-shirt. I was going to get all dressed up in my Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, and this is what I happen to be wearing today. And I thought, no, I'm leaving this on, because just as this character, Don Quixote, is tilting uselessly at windmills, we tilt at windmills when we decide that we're going to get rid of all the evil in the world, and that we're going to purify everything, and that we're going to make sure that we don't have to be around evil. I'm not saying that we're tolerant of evil and we think evil is okay. I'm saying we have to learn that there are imperfections in life. Life is full of imperfections, and we have to learn to live among those imperfections. Maxie Dunham makes a great point when he says, if you don't believe that there are imperfections in the world, take a look at your own personal life. There is no perfect marriage. You may have been married or may be married to a great person, but if you've been married for more than a week, you have probably figured out that there is no happily ever after like we hear about in the fairy tales or we see in the crazy movies. There is no family that's perfect. There is no Leave It to Beaver family. There is no village or town like the ones you see in those Hallmark Christmas movies. Everything is not perfect like that all the time. Life is filled with imperfections. And if we're going to have a family life, if we're going to have a long-lasting marriage, one of the things that we quickly learn is that we have to learn to live with some imperfections in ourselves, in our spouses, and in our families. There's weeds among us, there's no denying it, but we can't pull up all the weeds. Now, in this parable, when the servants go running to the farmer or the landowner and they see the weeds, they say, "What do you want us to do? You want us to pull them up?" And what does the landowner say? He says, "No, don't pull them up. Don't pull them up, because if you do, you might pull out the wheat." But you know what the servants want to do? They want to pull that wheat up. They want to pull it out right away. Not the wheat. It'd help if I said this right. They want to pull up those weeds. They want to pull up the tares, as they were called. They want to get them out of there. And we have such a hard time not trying to do that, especially to other people. It's called tare pulling, T-A-R-E, tare pulling, or should I say tearing tares. I'm going to reaching over here, grabbing my book. There's a fellow that Maxie Dunham quotes. His name is Clovis G. Chappell, and he talks about how we have this tendency to want to get rid of all evil, especially sin in other people. So let me read what he says, because I love the way he put it. He calls it tare pulling, T-A-R-E, tare pulling. Tare pulling, he said, is one of the most appealing methods of dealing with evil that our world has ever known. In spite of the fact that Jesus did not sanction this method, his servants have never been able to let it alone. There is something tremendously appealing about the pulling of tares. If an evil is present, destroy it. If there is a false doctrine, demolish it. If there is a pagan idol, smash it. If there is a temple built to idolatry, tear it down. If there are tares growing among the wheat, pay no attention to the wheat. Look to the tares and pull them up. Yeah, that's the way we are. We want to get rid of evil in other people. We want to get rid of sin. And sometimes we get so hung up on that we forget about Christian values like love and fellowship and forgiveness and grace. The problem with wanting to tear up the weeds, to tear up the tares or to do this tare pulling, is that it's really hard to tell the weeds from the wheat. That's what this landowner tells his servants. You won't be able to tell them apart, or you may find them growing so closely together that when you try to pull up the weeds, you're also going to destroy the wheat. Friends, we are not capable of judging whether somebody else is a bad enough sinner that we need to pull them up. We can see sin and evil around us, but we are not qualified to judge other people. And a good example of that, I think, is that sometimes we have been shocked to find out someone that we thought was really, really a good person is involved in doing something terrible. And then we're amazed and astonished, because we are not as good as we like to think we are in judging other people. And we don't know what is in another person's heart. We see an action, but we don't know what is in their heart. We see something they do that angers us, but we don't know what is in their heart, and we don't know where their heart is moving or where it is at that one particular moment. There's a wonderful poem by Robert Burns called The Unco Good, or something like that. I'm not very good at pronouncing his, but basically it's to the ones who considered themselves unqualified good. And he has this long poem in there telling people that we have this tendency to want to judge other people, especially those of us who have not had life as difficult as some people have. But he says to them, what might have happened to you if you had run into the same circumstances as this poor person that you're looking down on? Might you have made the same mistakes? And he ends that poem with this stanza: who made the heart? 'Tis he alone decidedly can try us. He knows each chord, its various tone, each spring, its various bias. Then at the balance, let's be mute. We never can adjust it. What's done, we partly may compute, but know not what's resisted. I'm going to read those last two lines again because I love them. What's done, we partly can compute, but know not what's resisted. What I see there is we don't know what another person has dealt with. I'm going to just give an example from my personal life, and it can't make you uncomfortable that I'm getting this personal because you're not right here with me, but my mom, she was a really tough person to live with, very harsh, and she wasn't an alcoholic, but she sure drank a lot more than I wish she would have. And I sometimes was intolerant of her, but as I grew older, I realized that she was doing the best that she could do. She was raised by two parents who were alcoholics, who beat their children, who didn't provide a good living for them. So what was she dealing with all those years of being a little bit, she may have been harsh on us kids, but maybe she was trying to mold us into people who had a better life than what she did. Well, let me not get off on that tangent. We don't know what pressures she was resisting. We don't know what pressures or what difficulties another person is resisting. So it's not for us to be pulling up the weeds. It's for us to be tolerant and loving and patient and remembering that someone else has been tolerant with us and patient and loving with us. We don't try to pull up the weeds because we're not qualified to judge and because we may harm the wheat, the good, in trying to pull up the weeds. Think about what harm a person does to his or her own soul when they get busy trying to straighten out other people. There's so much irony in the fact that sometimes when we get to moralizing and judging, we hurt other people. Churches do this sometimes. They want to see themselves as called out and pure. And so they do one of two things, and this is something I'm getting from Maxie Dunham. It's a good idea he had. One is that sometimes you see a church that gets, or church people that just get hung up with doctrine. And they tell you, by golly, if somebody doesn't believe like this, if somebody doesn't preach like this, you should have nothing to do with them. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, I'm getting my Bible because I want to wag it around here, I only go by everything that's in this book right here. And you should be preaching the good book and nothing but the good book. And somebody that doesn't do that, we should get rid of them. And they're being intolerant while they claim that what they love is the Bible. They want to be doctrinally pure to the point that they decide that they can be judge and jury over whether another person is a real Christian or not. Or they get hung up on morality and they decide they want to put people out of the church or put people away from them who are sinners. Well, aren't we all sinners? How are we going to decide which sins are the bad sins and which sinners we need to exclude. But friends, churches do that all the time, and it hurts me to think that we do that. We decide which sins we want to exclude. I am not saying that we are tolerant of people who are hurting other people. What I am saying is that we don't get all moralistic and start judging other people and deciding, well, if you commit this sin, then you can't be a Christian. None of us could be a Christian if the criteria was that we don't commit sin. We can do more harm to ourselves when we're trying to pull up those weeds because we make ourselves become intolerant and judgmental. And when we are not forgiving, we have trouble being forgiven. I'm not saying that God doesn't love us. I'm saying that we begin to put a hard shell around ourselves, and God can't reach through that hard shell because we won't let him. The problem is when we become judgmental, when we try to pull up the weeds, we don't leave room for grace. We don't leave room for God's love. We become cold and indifferent, and we adopt the evil ways of the world in the name of morality. Let's look at what the solution was of this landowner. There's weeds. There are weeds growing in that wheat. There is evil in the world. There is sin even among the church people. What shall we do? The farmer basically says, be patient. Leave them alone, and it will be taken care of at the harvest time. Yes, leave them alone. Look at Jesus as an example of how that was done. Jesus was tolerant of sinners. Do you hear what I'm saying? Jesus was tolerant of sinners. In Jesus's day, sinners were outcasts, just like lepers. You all have heard about how lepers had to stay out of the village and go around hollering out, unclean, unclean. Well, that same attitude was brought to bear on people who were identified as sinners, and you had nothing to do with sinners. That is one of the reasons that the Pharisees and other religious leaders complain about Jesus, because he spends time with sinners. He spends time with tax collectors and women of loose moral reputations. How can this be? Jesus was loving towards sinners. Jesus was tolerant towards sinners, because what he recognized is that they needed love and forgiveness. They needed a father, and they needed the Father's grace. And so instead of shunning them, Jesus sat down at table with them. Yes, Jesus would tell people, go and sin no more. But he did this in a way that was loving. First and always, he let them know God forgives you. God loves you. You don't have to earn God's love. I love you just as you are. Now, and of course that would make a person want to be better. And of course he would say, go and sin no more. Walk in the grace of God. There's a wonderful story in the Gospel of Luke. In Luke's Gospel, when the lady washes the feet of Jesus, she is a woman known to be a sinner, or at least known by the Pharisee who has Jesus over for a meal as a sinner. And as a matter of fact, that Pharisee is looking at Jesus as this woman is washing the feet of Jesus with her tears and her hair. He thinks to himself, the Pharisee does, boy, if he knew who this woman was, he wouldn't let her touch him. And Jesus reprimands him for that and says about this woman, her many sins have been forgiven. So she has shown great love. The one who is forgiven little loves little. Do you hear that? Jesus was tolerant with that sinner, and he said she shows great love because she knows that she was loved and she knows that she was forgiven. The one who has been forgiven little loves little. Well, did that mean that Jesus wouldn't forgive this Pharisee? That, oh, I'm only going to forgive you a little? No. I think what he meant is, I can't forgive you. God can't forgive you for much. If you think you haven't done anything, you think you're not a sinner, and you got to straighten out those other sinners and pull up those weeds. Instead, we are patient. We love. We live among imperfection. We live among sinners, recognizing that we ourselves are sinners. We are patient. And as Paul says, we overcome evil with good. And by the way, when I'm talking about this tear pulling and this overcoming evil with good, I mean within ourselves as well. Because sometimes we become intolerant with ourselves. Now, it's good to recognize that we are sinners, and it's good to go to God and ask His forgiveness. But sometimes we become intolerant even of our own humanity. I've been reading a book that Pastor Beth gave to me by Trevor Hudson, and one of his chapters he talks about dealing with negative emotions and negative feelings. I wasn't planning to read this whole thing, so I don't have it marked. But, he talked about the fact that we have trouble sometimes dealing with the fact that we have negative emotions. He says, as a Christ follower, I sometimes struggle to live with some of my feelings, especially those that seem unchristian and foreign to the ways of the gospel. And I'm thinking of feelings like dislike and hostility and hatred, feelings like envy and jealousy and competition, feelings like lust and desire and greed. Almost every day, emotions like this ambush me and mock my attempts to live as Jesus had lived. For many years, I chided myself for even having such feelings, but today I have come to recognize them as part and parcel of being human. What he's saying is, I love the fact he said these emotions would ambush him, because he was trying to live like Jesus would have him live, and yet he feels these emotions. And he realized this is part and parcel of being human. It's not that we don't have negative emotions. It's not that we don't ever have jealousy or envy or anger. It's what do we do with it? We don't want to do what some people do, which is like if we have anger, just burst out and just, give in to those emotions. We don't want to hold them in and let them seethe within us and churn and roil and boil because they're really not gone. Here's what Hudson's solution is. Here's how you live with the weeds within yourself. He says you go to Jesus in prayer and you tell him honestly, this is what I am feeling. This is what I am dealing with. I am angry, or I am jealous. I'm feeling this. And then you ask Jesus not only to forgive you for those emotions, but more importantly, you ask Jesus to help you learn to live with that emotion, to learn to take those feelings and turn them for good, to overcome evil with good. You don't depend on yourself. You go to Jesus and you let Jesus do this for you. As he quotes an Anne Long in a book called Listening, where she says, emotional maturity is not about becoming dispassionate, but rather living in the fullness of my God-given humanity, discovering and owning my emotions, and learning to express them and share them appropriately. And instead of trying to do that all by ourselves, we take it to Jesus and we ask for help. I am a sinner, Lord. I cannot rise above what I am unless you help me. And then we trust that he really will help us. Paul reminds us that we overcome evil with good. And he tells us that in other human beings. I love this in Galatians because he's talking about getting along with other Christians. And this is something we can apply to members of our family, members of the church, and other humans as well. Brothers and sisters, says Paul, if a person is caught doing something wrong, you who are spiritual should restore someone like that with a spirit of gentleness. Watch out for yourselves so that you won't be tempted too. Carry each other's burdens, and so you will fulfill the law of Christ. This is how we live with the weeds among the wheat. We are patient with each other. We are gentle with each other. If we find someone doing wrong, instead of casting them away or looking down on them, he says that we help them with a spirit of gentleness, and we watch out for ourselves so that we won't become tempted to be cruel and harsh as we deal with them. He goes on near the end of this 6th chapter to say, let's not get tired of doing good, because in time we will have a harvest if we don't give up. So then let's work for the good of all whenever we have an opportunity, and especially for those in the household of faith. So be patient, my friends. Leave the weeds alone. The wonderful thing about this story, is to go back to that parable, is in the end, the harvesters came and took care of everything. So we can be patient. We can live among the weeds. We can live with the weeds within ourselves. We can work with Jesus to overcome evil with good and love and gentleness and forgiveness, the same way in which Jesus pulled us to himself. We can be patient. We can leave the weeds alone, and we can trust the Lord of the harvest. My friends, as you look forward to the new year and setting those resolutions, if you do that, then may this be one of your resolutions, that you will be willing to go to Jesus in prayer, that you will tell Jesus about your negative emotions and your frustrations and those sort of things, including when you're angry at someone. And then you will let Jesus help you to overcome those emotions, to live with all of the weeds in the world, and to know that the Lord of the harvest is in charge. Happy New Year's, my friend, and may God bless you all.